Hello, my name is Phil Easter, historian and writer from Baltimore, Maryland, also known as the Amazing Memory Man. We're recording on Sunday, January 14th, 2024. This is story number 43 on my YouTube channel, which is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. First, I would like to wish everyone a very happy New Year 2024. I wish all of you health and happiness in this new year. Tonight, we will mention the events I have memorized for every day of the month of January, the 31 days of January, many historical events, and a few from my personal life as well. So we start with New Year's Day, January 1st. I find it interesting that two very important events happened on New Year's Day in the year 1863, the very same day, literally. In this country, during America's Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed many black people from slavery, although it did not free all black people from slavery. This is often taught incorrectly in many schools, I happen to know. Some teachers say it freed all the slaves. What it did was it freed slaves in the 11 states that were in rebellion to the Union, often called the Confederate States of America. But it did not free the slaves in 4 Union states, such as Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. And the reason for that was this came about halfway during the Civil War, as it turned out. Lincoln's main purpose was to win the war and preserve the Union. And the last thing he wanted to do was to irritate the slave owners in 4 states that were still loyal to the Union, hanging by a thread, as Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri were. So after the Civil War, some months after, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is the final law that ended all slavery in the United States and territories thereof. But at least emancipation was the first step, so it technically freed slaves in the 11 Confederate states, although effectively speaking, no one was freed that day because the Union and Confederate armies did not fight during the winter. So sometime later that spring, when Union armies would recapture certain areas of Confederate states, is when slaves would actually be freed. But at least the law went into effect technically on New Year's Day, 1863. But also, in Paris, France, was born a child named Pierre de Coubertin. And he would be the man, many years later, who would be the founder of the modern Olympic Games, a very important force in sports and really in cultural matters as we get to the 20th century and now the 21st century. The first modern Olympics were organized in 1896 and held in Athens. But Pierre de Coubertin was born on New Year's Day, 1863, the Frenchman who founded the modern Olympic Games. January 2nd, in 1959, the day that Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba had ended, they overthrew the government of Batista, a dictator. But of course, Castro was also a dictator, just from a different angle, a socialist or communist dictator, and he ruled Cuba for many years. Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution, victorious on January 2nd, 1959. January 3rd, that was the day in 1959, just one day after Castro in Cuba, that was the day that Alaska became America's 49th state. And later that same year, by the way, on August 21st, Hawaii became the 50th state. So those 2 states were admitted the same year, 1959. January 4th, in 1987, there was an Amtrak train crash here in this state of Maryland, which killed about 16 people and injured over 100. Many of the people who died and were injured were college students. It was a Sunday, January 4th, that year was a Sunday, and returning to their colleges after the Christmas and New Year's break, a very sad event. It made national news, of course. And the engineer or driver of that train It was later found out he'd been smoking marijuana earlier that day and was under the influence, and 16 people died. On January 5th, we go way back to the year 1066, almost 1,000 years ago. That was the day that the English king, known as Edward the Confessor, died. He'd ruled England for over 20 years. He's the only English king to ever be canonized a saint by the Catholic Church. Edward the Confessor died January 5th, 1066. Harold II then became king, but not for very long. Just 9 months later, Harold was killed at the famous Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, and thus William, known as William the Conqueror, but also William I, would rule England for the next 21 years. January 6, in 1994, that was the day a very disgusting event happened in women's sports. The Winter Olympics were scheduled for Lillehammer, Norway, 1 month later in February. But of course, there were several young lady figure skaters trying to make the United States Olympic team. One of the favorites was Nancy Kerrigan from Massachusetts. One of her rivals, a young lady named Tonya Harding, hired a man to injure Nancy. As Nancy left the ice that day from practice, this man walked up to her with an ice pick and slammed her in the knees with an ice pick. Really awful thing to do. An attempt to make Nancy injured enough that she'd have to pass up the Olympics just 1 month later. But I'm happy to say that disgusting plan by Tonya Harding failed. Nancy still made the Olympic team. As a matter of fact, in Lillehammer, Norway, she finished a close second for the silver medal. A young lady from Ukraine won the gold medal. But I wonder if even that injury had still slowed her up enough that if that injury had not happened, maybe Nancy would have won gold, but still at least she won the silver medal. And Tonya Harding finished way back, something like 10th place or something like that. Why they allowed her to compete, I don't know. It's just disgusting. It was pretty well known she had done this, and they still allowed her to compete in the Olympics. But that event was one of the big news items in the United States for the first 2 months of the year 1994. But also, just 3 years ago, on January 6, 2021, the day President Donald Trump gave a speech close to the White House, there were about 10,000 of his supporters were there. But a little while later, approximately 800 of his supporters attacked the Capitol, you could say, because they weren't marching in peacefully. They even brought weapons, and some brought ice hockey sticks and other things, and they actually were trying to get into the Capitol and overwhelmed many of the police officers. There just weren't enough Capitol Police that day. A very sad event where 5 people died. But I would like to point out also that the news media, I must say, doesn't always point out that most of the Trump supporters were not among those who went in. 9,200 of that 10,000 people did not go into the Capitol. They were peaceful, but unfortunately 800 did that, broke the law, and injured people and destroyed property, and they were threatening to kill Vice President Mike Pence. And fortunately, the Vice President and the senators and Congress people were hiding somewhere that was safe, and the security guards, the police showed great bravery. A terrible event when 800 of Trump's supporters attacked the Capitol of the United States, January 6, 2021. January 7th, that was the birthday of President Millard Fillmore. He was born January 7th, 1800. He became America's 13th president. January 8th was the day the famous singer Elvis Presley was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. January 8th, 1935, Elvis Presley born. January 9th was the day that President Richard Nixon was born in California in 1913. He became America's 37th president in 1969. He won 2 terms, but he would have to resign in disgrace because of the Watergate break-in, and trying to cover that up, he resigned August 9th, 1974. But again, he was born January 9th, 1913. January 10th was the day, way back in 1863, that Queen Victoria of England opened up the first part of the famous London subway system. They often call it, the English often call it the Underground or the Tube, but that I don't think it was a very long stretch of track at that time, but the London Underground, Tube, subway, whatever, has become one of the most famous in the world for a great city. And I've been to London 6 times in my life and often used the Tube, a great way to get around. So just so you know, Her Majesty Queen Victoria officially opened that on January 10th, 1863. January 11th is the birthday of the runner, the lady runner, Madeline Mims. Actually, come to think of her middle name, her middle name also begins with the letter M. I think it's Madeline Manning Mims. And she was born in 1948, and 20 years later at the Mexico City Olympics, she became the first American female runner to ever win the 800-meter race in 1968, her gold medal at the Mexico City Olympic Games. January 12th is the birthday of a great runner from the country of New Zealand. John Walker was born January 12th, 1952. The same year, yours truly was born, a little later on October 17th, but anyhow, I saw John Walker at the Montreal Olympics in 1976. On July 31st, 1976, he won the men's 1,500-meter race at the Montreal Olympic Games. January 13th, that was the day, 46 years ago, Hubert Horatio Humphrey died that day, former American vice president, and he was senator for many years from the state of Minnesota. I saw him speak at Johns Hopkins University on April 25th, 1973, and he had a great sense of humor. He was, what some politicians do, and somebody asked him that day about Congress, isn't Congress a bunch of fools? And he replied, well, yes, but there are some fools in the general public too, and they have a right to be represented. But unfortunately, Senator Humphrey, he was a senator at the time of his death, died January 13th, 1978, only 66 years old. Well, the very next day, 1978 he died at the age of 66. The very next day, January 14th, 1978, the British runner Harold Abrahams died in England. I first heard about Harold Abrahams when I saw that wonderful movie which came out in 1981, the Academy Award-winning film, Chariots of Fire, which has become my favorite movie of all time. So I've done further research on Harold Abrahams and also Eric Liddell, the other major runner in that movie, portrayed in that movie by actors. And very soon I will do a YouTube story about Abrahams and Liddell. I'll call it Chariots of Fire, a story of Harold Abrahams and Eric Liddell. That'll be coming pretty soon on my YouTube channel. But that's the day that Abrahams died in 1978. January 15th was the birthday of the great civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was born in 1929, and indeed the third Monday of January each year is celebrated as King's birthday. And so it just so happens tomorrow, literally tomorrow, January 15th this year, is the exact day that the third Monday of January falls upon. So they'll be celebrating his birthday tomorrow. And also, however, in 2009, January 15th, 15 years ago, what could have been a terrible tragedy was averted in New York City. A pilot, shortly after taking off from LaGuardia Airport, noticed his airplane was not acting right, and it's going to come down pretty soon. So New York's such a big city with so many buildings close together. He decided the best chance was to land the plane in the Hudson River. Incredibly, Captain Sullenberger landed that plane, and no one was killed, and maybe just a few slight injuries, but no one injured terribly bad. Incredible bravery he showed. 59-year-old Captain Sullenberger. And some time ago, there was a movie came out called Captain Sully about that incident. The Miracle on the Hudson, it's been called. That was 15 years ago tomorrow, on January 15, 2009. January 16th was the birthday of Eric Liddell, the other of those two major runners in Chariots of Fire. He was born January 16th, 1902. January 17th, several famous Americans born. Benjamin Franklin, one of our great founding fathers and a great inventor, was born January 17th, 1706. In 1942, the great heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali was born in the state of Kentucky, January 17th, 1942. His real name was Cassius Clay, but later on he changed it to Muhammad Ali. And actually, that very great lady of comedy, Betty White, she was born January 17th, 1922. And she lived a long life. She died just a few years ago on December 31st, 2021. If she could live 17 more days, she would have been exactly 100 years old. Betty White. Many people enjoyed her movies and television shows. January 18th, birthday of Daniel Webster in the year 1782. Became a lawyer and very famous from the state of Massachusetts. Also, I would like to add that my dear mom, Mary Carolyn Robinson, was her name at birth, and she was born January 18th, 1915. And of course, later became, when she married my father, then her name was Easter, of course, but her original name, Mary Carolyn Robinson, born January 18th, 1915, in Altoona, Pennsylvania. January 19th, birthday of two famous Americans. Robert E. Lee was born that day in 1807, became an officer in the United States Army for many years, and in fact, he was the commander of the group of soldiers that arrested John Brown at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, on October 16th, 1859. Brown was leading a rebellion against the United States. Ironically then, when the Civil War broke out, or shortly after the war broke out, Robert E. Lee decided to side with the Confederate Army. He said more than once, however, if Virginia had remained loyal to the Union, he would remain loyal. But he could not go against the state of Virginia, and they became part of the Confederacy. He became a famous general during the Civil War and was actually the Confederacy's top general, appointed January 1865, but that was just a few months before the war ended. He had a number of famous victories, but did lose at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. But 2 years after he was born, in 1809 on January 19th, the famous writer Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston, Massachusetts. A very famous mystery writer of the 19th century, wrote novels and poems. One of his famous works was The Raven, and he lived in Virginia for some years, but he came here to Baltimore, Maryland, and the last few years of his life was here in Baltimore, where he died on October 7th, 1849. So there's two famous Americans born January 19th, Robert E. Lee and Edgar Allan Poe. January 20, every 4 years since 1937, is Presidential Inauguration Day. It may surprise some people to know it wasn't always January 20th. The very first inauguration of George Washington was on April 30th, 1789. Then his second term began on March 4th, 1793. And for most of the next well over 100 years, Presidential Inauguration Day was March 4th, including Franklin Roosevelt's first term in 1933, it was still March 4th. But sometime over the next 4 years, they changed it to January 20th. So since 1937, all the presidents have been inaugurated January 20th. Of course, when a president dies in office, or in the case of Nixon when he resigned, that's an emergency situation. The vice president becomes president. But we're talking about scheduled inauguration days a few months after a November election, now January 20. Also, however, in 1993, the very day Bill Clinton became president, sadly, the great actress Audrey Hepburn died. I think she was only about 64 years old. And she was one of my favorite movie actresses of all time. January 21st, that was the day in 1924 that the first leader of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, died that day, January 21st, 1924. January 22nd, that was the day in 1901 that Queen Victoria died. She had been queen from 1837, so she made it to the 20th century just by 22 days, really, because the 20th century really began January 1st, 1901, not the year 1900, as many people incorrectly believe. A century really begins in the year ending 01. So she made it to the 20th century by 22 days. But also in 1973, that was the day the Supreme Court ruled its famous Roe versus Wade decision, legalizing abortion in the United States of America, which, however, was recently overturned to the extent that now it's up to each state. Each state can decide whether they're for abortion or not. But also the same day in 1973, that famous Supreme Court ruling at that time, former President Lyndon Johnson died. He was just 64 years old. And in sports, there was a major upset in heavyweight boxing as George Foreman beat Joe Frazier. Another sports item that here in Baltimore, the great quarterback of Johnny Unitas of the Baltimore Colts football team was traded to the San Diego Chargers. So there were a number of things there that happened, at least 4 news events that happened on January 22nd, 1973, all in one day. January 23rd, that was the day the great television host Johnny Carson died in 2005. His show was very popular. For 30 years, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was seen by millions of people across the United States from 1962 to 1992. January 24th was the day in 1965 the great British statesman and former Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill died at the age of 90. Sometime I think I'll do a whole YouTube story just about the life of Churchill, one of the most famous and interesting people in world history. January 25th was the day in 1759 that the Scottish poet Robert Burns was born. By the way, 1759, not far from there in Ireland, that was the year that the Guinness drink was founded, a very nice beverage called Guinness. Many people like to celebrate, especially on St. Patrick's Day. But anyhow, it was Robert Burns' birthday, January 25th, 1759. January 26th is celebrated by the country of Australia as Australia Day. And many English people went there in the late 1700s. I think January 26, 1788 was the day an English ship arrived in Australia. So the Australians celebrate as their national day. January 27th was the day in 1756 the great composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in Austria. But sadly also in 1967, that was the day America lost 3 astronauts in the space program. I remember this very well, watching the CBS Evening News that night. It was a Friday night, January 27th, 1967. I was a freshman in high school, and I was spending the night at a friend's house with the whole family. My friend Bill, who was 13, I was 14 at the time, and his mom and 2 sisters and a younger brother lived there with the father of the family. And we were watching the CBS Evening News at 6:30 that evening and heard the sad news of the 3 astronauts killed at Cape Canaveral, Florida in a training exercise. One of those astronauts was named Gus Grissom. He was, I think, the senior astronaut at that time in the U.S. space program. Had he not died that day, many people believe that 2 years later, he would have been the first man to walk on the moon in 1969. But of course, that honor went to Neil Armstrong. But getting back to that day when we heard the news of their deaths, that broadcast was over about 7 o'clock in the evening. A little while later, in the very house where I was staying with the family, the father died. He had been sick for a long time. He had cancer. He was only 56 years old. But it was rather shocking, if I may say, and of all nights to be spent the night there with the family, which you only did once in a while, the day the father died of that family. And of course, there was great sadness naturally, and I was shook up a little bit too. You weren't expecting that, and the news of the astronauts being killed just a few minutes before was quite a lot to take, if I may say, emotionally. So that day, I really remember, January 27th, 1967, an upsetting event in my life, the same day where a national tragedy happened. January 28th was the day in 1986 that the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up over the state of Florida, 59 seconds after taking off at Cape Canaveral. 7 brave astronauts died that day, including a lady astronaut. I think it was Krista McCullough, I believe it was. And she was a school teacher, hoping to become the first school teacher to ever go into space. January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger tragedy. It was also the day, however, in 2001, that the Baltimore Ravens won the Super Bowl for the first time. The Baltimore Ravens have won 2 Super Bowls, and the first was January 28th, 2001. They beat the New York Giants 34-7. I remember watching that game at a bar that night. January 29th was the day in 1820 that King George III of England died. He had been king for 60 years, from 1760 to 1820. The longest reign of any king in English history. There have been 2 queens that have reigned longer, Queen Victoria and, of course, Queen Elizabeth II, who just died recently on September 8, 2022. But at least among the male monarchs of Great Britain, King George III reigned 60 years. January 30th is what I call a symbol of power day. Events regarding a number of men of power who were political leaders in most cases. In one case, Mahatma Gandhi, the great man from India, was certainly interested in politics and helping gain the freedom of India from Great Britain. Not directly a politician, but let's do it in order, and that would be January 30th in the year 1649. King Charles I of England was executed. He lost that civil war between the king and parliament, and Oliver Cromwell was at that point the leader of the parliamentary forces. So King Charles had been deposed and he was executed on January 30th, 1649. In 1882, Franklin Roosevelt was born in New York State. And of course, he became America's 32nd president and was very important during both the Great Depression and World War II. He was elected 4 times, 1932, 36, 40, and 44. No other American president was ever elected 3 times, let alone 4 times. And shortly after he died is when they made the law that you cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. But also in 1933, that was the day Adolf Hitler gained power in Germany. He was elected chancellor. He was actually elected initially, but then the next year when he was given the title of Führer in 1934, he made sure no more elections could take place. But he was elected by the people on January 30th, 1933 as Chancellor of Germany. And then in 1948, on January 30th, that was the day Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in New Delhi, India. I think he was 78 years old, and one of his famous quotes was, someone once asked him, what do you think of that famous quote from the Bible, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? To which Gandhi replied, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Interesting statement, something to think about. January 31st, the last day of the month, was the day in 1919 the great baseball player Jackie Robinson was born. Jackie Robinson, in 1947, played with the Brooklyn Dodgers for 10 years, from 1947 through 1956. It was also the day in 1958 that the United States entered the space race by putting up the satellite, but it was just a few months after the Soviet Union put up Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. So the space race was on between the Soviet Union and the United States as of January 31st, 1958. Also would like to mention briefly that a very good friend of mine named Jack was born January 31st, 1946. And I've known Jack for 46 years now, since 1978. And we went to a number of sports events together over the years, including some World Series baseball games. And one of the soccer games of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics we saw in Annapolis, Maryland, because the first week of competition, some of the soccer games were at East Coast locations, even though most of the sports were in Los Angeles directly for the Olympics. The famous Harvard University up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, had some of the soccer games. So Jack and I went to one of those games in 1984. Well, those are the events I know for the month of January, mostly from history and some from my personal life as well. Very happy to start this new year sharing again with all of you, and we'll look forward to the next story. I'm pretty sure my next story will be about the runners in the movie Chariots of Fire. And it's interesting that the 1924 Olympics were in Paris, and now 100 years later this summer, once again, the City of Lights will host the Great Olympic Games. This is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. Thank you. Happy New Year. We'll see you next time. Good night.